If you look at the days, the S&P 500, the leading equity index has fallen 2%. Bitcoin falls more than that. I think it's 90% of those days. But if you look 2 or 3 weeks out, it's recovered all that and 4 or 5 times that. And I expect that to be the case now. I think an investor looking how to hedge this current economic uncertainty would be crazy not to have a core position in crypto. It's just been the best tool for that for long-term investors for the past 10 years. And I think it's better positioned than ever.
Today's episode is brought to you by Stacks. Bitcoin's $1 trillion potential is untapped. Stacks unlocks it. Convert BTC to SBTC and earn up to 5% APY in Bitcoin. No custodians, just trustless DeFi. Your Bitcoin working harder. Bet on Bitcoin's future now. Welcome in, everybody, into another episode of Coinage. I'm your host, Zach Guzman, coming to you live from our Brooklyn studio here in New York City as we are watching Bitcoin cling to that all-important $80,000 level right now, seeing that all play out as market jitters continue to ripple through, as we're watching these Trump tariffs not just shake up what's going on in crypto, but also what's going on in macro as well, which is why very happy to have on the show with us today a man who knows markets well. Not just crypto, not just traditional markets, but how they all interweave together. Very happy to have on with us today Bitwise's CIO, Matt Hougan. Matt, it's good to see you, man.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, thank you for hopping back on. And I think, one of the first places to start is we were talking back in January when we saw kind of some of the early initial jitters, volatility. I think we flew back down from like 105 or something into the mid 90s. You came on, you said, hold on, everybody, things aren't going to be that crazy. We bounced back up. Now here we are flirting with 80K, Matt, and I feel like we're having the same convo again. What do you kind of look at here with where we're at?
Yeah, look, I appreciate it. I think there are two things that are happening in the market simultaneously, and it's important to think about them separately. So you mentioned at the top, on the one hand, we have these new macro jitters, right? The world is starting to price in the possibility that tariffs and DOGE might drive the US economy into recession. And that's affecting all risk assets. We saw the NASDAQ have a negative 4% day yesterday, one of the 10 worst days since the financial crisis. So it's a big deal, and that trickles over into Bitcoin. And then we have somehow the market having expressed disappointment with the executive order establishing a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And that is also negatively impacting the crypto market. So you combine those two and you get this pullback to 80K. As I look at it, my base case, and we can dig into them, is that both of these are the wrong assumption. I think there is risk on the macro side, but broadly speaking, I think the economy or the government will blink before we actually drive into a recession, but we can debate that. On the executive order side, I'm 100% confident the market is just wrong. I think that was the most bullish version of an executive order we possibly could have gotten. I think the market has overlooked what the executive order actually says, and I think it will soon realize that that's a bullish catalyst. So if we can equalize on this economic front, then I think there is sort of dry powder to catalyze us forward from the hangover from the executive order.
Yeah, let's talk about it and dig into the executive order because there is still hope. We just had Sean Farrell from Fundstrat kind of come on and talk about things that can be done as a result of that executive order, perhaps even as far as the government kind of rebasing how much gold in dollar terms they hold and then potentially take some of that and put it into Bitcoin without going through the route of Congress. And that would seem like it would be a little bit additional because that wouldn't just be holding existing Bitcoin. It would be actually adding new Bitcoin. And that's a piece that could potentially come. But I guess it does seem like, back to our last convo, a lot of people were debating whether or not a stockpile or the idea of just holding Bitcoin would be enough. But it seems like when we're down here at 81, Matt, that like a lot of that was priced in. So what exactly is that the piece that you're excited about from the EO, or is there something else?
Yeah, I mean, you're pointing in the right direction, which is the market is upset that the executive order didn't, call for us to smash by 200,000 Bitcoin a year. But executive orders can't do that. They don't control the purse strings. What it said is that the Secretary of Commerce and Treasury shall investigate ways to add Bitcoin to this balance sheet as long as it doesn't negatively impact shareholders. Not that it may or that it could, but that they shall do it. And so, what I expect them to do is to find ways to add Bitcoin. I do think they may look at selling some gold to balance the government's hard asset store. I think they'll look at other ways to add Bitcoin. But regardless, I think the number of Bitcoin that's in the reserve today is the minimum number, and it's likely to go up in the long term. And more than that, the signaling this provides to other governments around the world, I think will catalyze a race to acquire Bitcoin. So I just think short term investors are asking the wrong question. It's not, is the government going to buy my bags in the next 2 weeks? Is the executive order pushing us towards a world where Bitcoin is an important macro asset that's being purchased and held by governments around the world? And viewed from that lens, it's literally the most bullish executive order text that we could have imagined. I think it's a strong positive, and I just think the market has it wrong.
If they do have it wrong, I guess the next question would be when they start to come around to your view. And the reason for that is because you have a lot of people who are like looking at it being like, okay, if we break through 80, does that mean we go all the way back to where we were pre-election to be around kind of that 62 level before Trump won? And like, I guess, it's impossible for you to know necessarily, but when you add everything up, I mean, we were just looking at the CoinShares chart in terms of inflows or outflows. I mean, I guess you can look at that, Matt, and say, look, okay, maybe some of the worst is over. Maybe people aren't selling as much out of these ETFs anymore because the bulk of what we're seeing on this chart is Bitcoin outflows over the last few weeks. So what number in your head or kind of where do you think we could eventually have all this bad attitude flush out?
Yeah, great question. From my view, if you're investing in Bitcoin, you're making a bet that it'll be worth $1 million in the future, right? That it's undervalued by a factor of 5 or 10 or 20. And so whether you buy it 80 or 70 or 90 or 100 is almost irrelevant to me. I do think there's some risk we trade back to like the $72,000 level, which was a previous level of support, previous all-time highs, pre-election. So I think there's that level of risk. The way to think about the market is during bear markets, the market ignores good news. It doesn't go away. It just gets sort of stored as future energy. And I think that's what's happening now. The market is ignoring the good news. What that means for me is when will we turn? I don't know. We'll probably turn when the market starts to feel comfortable from a macro perspective that either we're going to get lower rates or stimulus checks or some sort of quantitative easing. Once the market sort of accepts that that is going to end up happening, we'll probably bottom from a macro perspective. And then all this good news will rapidly get repriced. So to summarize, we could go back to 72. But I really think if you look at the text of the executive order, what's written in there is words that will drive Bitcoin to multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so, I wouldn't be too precious trying to time the exact bottom in this market.
Yeah, what's interesting is, we're talking a lot about Bitcoin here, but I suppose we could have the same kind of conversation right now about Ethereum as well, since that one seemed like a pretty important line in the sand at 2,000, and now dipping below it here at these levels is kind of like, oh boy, how bad could this one get? And I think similarly, if you think about it, Eric Trump was just tweeting, I think, around 25% higher, saying that now would be a good time to buy. And so I think you're right, Matt. I mean, it's very difficult to market time these things, but at the same time, if you're down 30% or so because you listen to Eric Trump and now you're sitting there being like, I mean, like you would say buy my bags because you're sitting there on some losses now. And so, I mean, I guess when you look beyond Bitcoin, because let's keep that in the camp, but increasingly as kind of more people look at, as I'm sure you guys are doing too at Bitwise, more cryptos beyond Bitcoin, what the strategy is there, maybe specifically with Ethereum.
Yeah, I think people's thought on how to value those assets is changing. I think there's this perception that altcoins could be just treated as high beta versions of Bitcoin that would rally subsequent to Bitcoin in a classic alt season cycle. And I actually think we're moving into a new regime where those assets are evaluated independently on their metrics and tractions. So as you look at something like Ethereum, I think what you really need to look through to the activity on the layer twos, look through to stablecoin activity, tokenization activity, AI agentic activity, DeFi activity, and see where those are going. And eventually that'll get priced into Ethereum. But my guess is once you get beyond Bitcoin, we're actually going to have lower correlations between these different coins that we have in the past. I think they're moving into sort of their utility phase. And so it's really going to matter, are they attracting users? Are they attracting new important applications? And I think you're going to see sort of a rapid separation of the good ones from the bad ones. I think the bottoming process could take longer in those assets than it does in Bitcoin, for that reason, because people will be waiting to see those users arrive.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that too, because I feel like, the next big thing that a lot of people are looking forward to is this idea, and, I was just out at ETH Denver talking about it with the co-founder of Etherealize, the idea of bringing institutional investor attention and excitement back from where Solana was able to do that into the Ethereum ecosystem. And when you think about Solana, we're seeing activity down there post-Trump, Libra, this meme coin craze, and what started the year, activities come way down. I think almost 90% if I'm looking at the charts right, which is pretty crazy considering there's so much excitement. I mean, what are you hearing from institutional investors? Because that's what we've also heard, is that look at the on-chain activity. But if that's also moving in the wrong direction, does that hurt the idea of an ETF coming out?
I think Solana could face some challenges on that front right now. If you look at what people are excited about, they're excited about stablecoins, tokenization, and AI. And I think the chains that you're seeing grab traction in those markets are Ethereum and layer twos, maybe chains like Near. I think those may become darlings, and Solana may have to sort of refine its footing. Ultimately, it's incredible technology, and their sort of core long-term user growth is really substantial. But if you think of Ethereum sort of suffering from a narrative gap in 2024, I think there's at least a risk that Solana suffers from a narrative gap as it transitions from meme coin sort of focused activity to more real world asset focused activity. I think it ultimately will. I think there'll probably be an amazing buying opportunity in Solana. But if you think about sort of the sine wave of those various narratives, I think Ethereum is probably on the upslope, and Solana is maybe curling around and trying to find its sort of next narrative flow.
Yeah, and look, as we've covered here, this is certainly not just meme coins. We've talked to builders in the space, DPIN, certainly there on Solana as well. I don't want to have
100%.
anyone clip this and be like, "Oh, Matt and Zach were just saying that it's meme coins," because I think you both feel that way, and I both feel this way.
I strongly feel that way, and I think if you're thinking long term, the case for Solana is extraordinarily strong. And what we proved through this sort of spike in meme coin activity is that it's tremendous throughput. It's got tremendous flexibility. It's tremendous proof of concept. And I agree that DPIN has a meaningful place there. I wouldn't own a portfolio of crypto assets that didn't include Solana. I think it's that important to the ecosystem. I'm just saying that from a narrative perspective, we're going to have to wait for this other piece to bubble up on Solana before it gains that attraction. So again, long-term investors, phenomenal entry points. I think they're going to 100x their users over the next handful of years. But you have to think about that narrative flow as well, and they're just at different points in that cycle.
Yeah, well, one element that I definitely wouldn't want to overlook that I think gets lost because so much of this has, as you said, been focused on kind of the executive order and what's happening in the White House is what's happening in Congress, because we were just kind of live streaming a House hearing around stablecoins and the idea of that potentially coming through in the next few days or weeks, and the market infrastructure bill. I did want to ask you, Matt, because it does seem kind of strange in terms of under Gensler, there were so many questions about everything beyond Bitcoin that I almost feel like now that we've moved beyond it with a pro-crypto SEC, it's kind of weird to only see Ripple and Cardano be the ones really having any gains since Trump won to point to. When you think about it, could have, like you said, impacted a Solana, a Kosh, all these other kind of crypto tokens that could have been attacked as being securities. Now being removed, I don't know why so much of that pop has been centralized in these random coins. And I understand the idea of them being included in a potential strategic stockpile. But does that surprise you?
I think the case with XRP is pretty clear, which is the bet you're making on XRP. It's a B2B oriented chain, and they were simply unable to execute on that strategy with the sword of the SEC on top of them. Other assets like Ethereum, Solana, etc., had more crypto native use, and so they were able to grow even with that regulatory uncertainty. So that makes some sense to me. But the entire space, in my view, should be revalued and reconsidered in this new regulatory era. And I'm quite frankly surprised it hasn't happened yet in the market. I think it will happen. I think it will affect a broad array of assets. They're all better off today than they were 6 months ago. And my base view is that the market doesn't understand how challenging it was 6 months ago, and so they don't appreciate sort of the wide open pasture that exists today. But they're going to recognize that as we start to see new apps come to market and new real world use cases come to market across multiple chains. But I really think, at least with XRP, it made some sense in that they were unable to execute on their core business strategy in any way, shape, or form for 4 years. So when you release that and they're now able to do that, I understand why it's rallied. It's important to know it doesn't mean they've won by any sense. They still have to prove themselves in the market, but at least now they have the chance. And so I think that's why they've done so well.
Yeah, and I think, it's a good point. I necessarily haven't thought about it that way, at least in terms of giving some of these other chains the ability to build the way that they have. But I guess, beyond it, Matt, to bring this full circle back to kind of the macro discussion that's playing out too is, look, no one's got a crystal ball. No one knows exactly when a lot of the tariff jitters that have been introduced here under Trump get flushed out. But if you could look ahead to kind of seeing how that could potentially play out, we always know, and we've been through this before, crypto essentially bounces faster back to normal than stocks because they're very good at, I guess, discounting in the idea of, again, not all of crypto, but a lot of crypto being kind of more tied to animal spirits and the idea of what's going to happen with interest rates. I mean, what are you watching and how far do you think in the future it'll take to get there, to maybe get closer back to the level we were on, to where your price calls of, I think last time we said it was like 400,000 on Bitcoin or something like that over next year. Where do we get back to that trajectory?
Yeah, 200,000 by the end of the year is our official forecast. We made that in December of last year, and we think it's still our base case. I think we'll get to that soon, right? I mean, in the end of the day, for the last 17 years, every time there's been an economic ripple around the world, politicians have talked tough, but ultimately buckled. It's too easy for them to push the easy button and gain favor from voters by bailing out the economy at any sort of sign of weakness. I think we're going to see that here as well. So I don't expect real economic pullback. I don't expect real austerity in the US. I think that would be good for the country long term, but I don't think Washington really has the spine to put us through that. So once we see Washington blink in some way, shape, or form, it could be from Fed officials talking about lower rates. It could be from renewed talk about Doge stimulus checks. It could be from renewed talk of lower taxes. As soon as we see that kind of response, I think we're bottom and we're off to the races. And you make a good point about Bitcoin falling first and bouncing first and higher. If you look at the days the S&P 500, the leading equity index, has fallen 2%. Bitcoin falls more than that. I think it's 90% of those days. But if you look 2 or 3 weeks out, it's recovered all that and 4 or 5 times that. And I expect that to be the case now. I think an investor looking how to hedge this current economic uncertainty would be crazy not to have a core position in crypto. It's just been the best tool for that for long-term investors for the past 10 years. And I think it's better positioned than ever. So, soon enough, we will get there.
I hope so. From your lips to God's ears in terms of when we see that bounce back come out. I think there's a lot of people who watch the show who definitely want to see it. And maybe, I know we've only got a couple minutes left here, Matt, but I think it's a good place to kind of shift to what's going on at Bitwise too, because you guys just introduced Own B, this kind of way to allocate to companies that are, to your point, following through on the idea of owning Bitcoin. Talk to me about what the hope is there, and maybe kind of, I guess, what you're trying to do with that one.
Yeah, look, we think there are three major sources of insatiable demand for Bitcoin. There's Bitcoin ETFs, and we have one of the largest ETFs in BITB. There are governments, as you have I been talking about, Zach. And then there's corporations, which we think are increasingly putting Bitcoin on the balance sheet and following the Bitcoin standard. There are now 70 publicly traded companies around the world, actually more than that, that collectively own about 650,000 Bitcoin. And we think that number will double or triple in the year ahead. So we launched a new ETF, OwnB, that owns companies that have 1,000 plus Bitcoin on their balance sheet. We think these are among the most forward-thinking companies in the world. They're firms, of course, like MicroStrategy, but behind MicroStrategy, there are dozens of other companies following that playbook or diversifying into Bitcoin. And if you want them all in one fund, you now can get them through OwnB. So we're excited to get this into the market. There's going to be more funds to follow, but I love seeing it out there and a great iconic ticker. And I think it's going to be an important ETF long term.
One question on that too, I guess, is it just triggered the idea of diversification of companies that own Bitcoin, because potentially just being in one, call MicroStrategy, that does, depending on how they play this game, could potentially eventually get into problems if the price of Bitcoin goes down, depending on how much debt load they have. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if you've kind of started to hear rumors or whispers of like, hey, should we take a look at maybe potential problems with MicroStrategy? But that's one that, I know Jeff Park at Bitwise has been all over, loves what MicroStrategy is doing, loves Michael Saylor. But I don't know if you're starting to hear like, hey, when does leverage become a bad thing?
Yeah, we think, we would look at the 2x levered versions of MicroStrategy as a source of, something to keep an eye on. But we look at all of these companies, to the extent they over lever, they'll get themselves into trouble. I think MicroStrategy itself is running, a conservative, thoughtful playbook at this point, but it's something we monitor. It's something we consider. So worth keeping an eye on. But I do think the bigger trend we're going to see is even large companies, even some of the large cap US companies eventually adding Bitcoin to their balance sheet. So there's both a conservative side to this and a side to monitor. That's crypto, risk and opportunity at the same time.
That's right. And that's why we have you on, to digest all of it. But I appreciate you taking the time, as always. Matt Hougan, the Chief Investment Officer over there at Bitwise. Thanks again, sir. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Zach. Appreciate it.
All right. That's going to do it for us this time on Coinage. As always, you can check out the biggest headlines around the world of Web3 and crypto at coinage.media and co-own our community-owned outlet with us, along with myself and the co-founder of Netflix as well. For Matt, for myself, for everybody here at Coinage, thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you again soon.